War of the Worlds, The Resurrection. A novel by J.M. Dillard. Chapter 14. Why do I love her? Harrison asked himself the next evening, pausing in the midst of his packing to gaze at Charlotte Phillipson again. She sat on the tie-dyed cotton bedspread of the narrow twin bed in his Spartan little bedroom. She'd once referred, with no small amount of disdain, to his decorating scheme as early American college student/hippie. There was still no carpet on the floor, and no furniture out in the living/dining area, except for the heavy mahogany dining room set his parents had left him. Char had tried to pick up the hippie theme by giving him an original Peter Max print, which Harrison despised, but left hanging in the living room for her sake. Now Charlotte sat on the bed, looking gorgeous and leggy in a short pink cashmere dress and a long strand of pearls. Clouds of Giorgio perfume wafted toward Harrison every time she moved. But her beauty was compromised by the fact that she sat stiff, erect, so disapproving and withdrawn that the universe seemed to curve inward near her. She gripped herself tightly and stared with cold, reproachful eyes at Harrison. At the moment, his question really had him stumped. He'd known earlier, just a few days it had seemed, why he loved her. But he seemed to have forgotten. Because she has a good sense of humor? He studied Char's baleful expression. Scratch that one. Because she never tries to manipulate me? Correction. You thought she didn't try to manipulate you until that damn party where you found out she was hoping you'd be impressed enough to want to work for that company. Because she's attractive? For now, it seemed the most promising explanation he could come up with. Since the threat of the aliens had become real once again, Char and all the things she cared about dwindled in importance to him. She seemed so petty, sitting there, and he realized with surprise that in the back of his mind he'd been comparing her to Suzanne McCullough and finding Char lacking, which would have thrilled Clayton no end. Maybe if he swore Char to secrecy and explained what was going on, she would understand. Yet, part of him was certain that if he did explain, Char would argue with him that the things she cared about were still more important. Char, with her silly parties and her social life, somehow made the ugliness of what the aliens had done, of what they might do, seem very unreal. Perhaps that was why he loved her, or thought he did. Maybe he didn't love her seriously at all. He'd kept the relationship light and airy on purpose. William Powell and Myrna Loy reincarnate. Possibly because he was afraid of losing anything really precious to him. He stared at Char and thought, if she left today, I would survive. He knew that somehow wasn't right.
I can't believe you're doing this,
Char said in her carefully cultivated, throaty voice, while Harrison stuffed a few pairs of jockey low-rise briefs into the zippered pouch of the hanging bag in his closet. He'd packed a navy jacket and khaki pants. He figured that would be fancy enough for the uptight folks in D.C., but he wasn't sure. Normally, he would have asked Char's advice on what to pack. He had no patience figuring out such things, but it didn't seem appropriate at the moment.
After dashing off from that party the night before last, then taking off for God knows where,
Char went on,
you expect me to believe you can't take an hour right now to talk to me? Frankly, Harrison, I'm beginning to think you're avoiding me on purpose.
Don't be ridiculous, Charlotte, he said curtly, zipping the pouch up. He'd taken a 2-hour nap, but fear and exhaustion still left him on edge. At the moment, he didn't have the patience to soothe her hurt feelings. You know I'd never do that. Something has come up at work.
Look at you.
She gestured at him with perfectly manicured hands, the nails hot pink, long and sharp.
You're spending 24 hours a day working for that damn institute, yet they pay you peanuts. Don't you realize that at Bleecker Williams you could quadruple your salary and work reasonable hours?
Harrison felt his face harden. Shar, don't ever mention that place again. You know how I feel about what they do, and you know I don't give a damn about working 9 to 5.
I went to a lot of trouble to get you that job offer,
she blurted angrily. Stunned, he gaped at her. From her tone of voice, it was clear she considered him an ingrate. So, he said softly, it wasn't their idea after all, was it? I'm amazed at you, Charlotte. Simply amazed. He shook his head in disgust and went back to packing with renewed energy. I'm not going to discuss my choice of career with you or anyone else. Case closed.
Damn it!
She cried, jumping up from the bed so that the strand of pearls swung, clicking.
Your career affects us, Harrison. It's us we have to talk about.
He glanced at his watch and very coolly replied, The plane takes off for Washington in 42 minutes. I barely have enough time to pick up Suzanne and make it to the airport. The discussion is going to have to wait. It was a lie. The plane wouldn't leave for another 90 minutes, but he'd had enough of this particular argument.
And that's more important than us?
There was a spoiled, whiny note in her voice that he found irritating. She was trying to force him into an either-or situation, and no way in hell was he going to let her do it. He turned his back to her and started rummaging through the closet to choose a tie. He had no idea what would match the navy and khaki, so he pulled out the closest one, a yellow silk Dior she'd given him. He waited until he could keep the anger from his voice, then said, his back still to her, It's not that cut and dried, Shar. What I'm doing right now is crucially important to you, to me, to everyone. It makes all this, he gestured expansively with an arm at the room, the world around him, seem very irrelevant.
Irrelevant?
She gasped.
We're irrelevant?
He faced her. Don't twist what I said. I can't tell you why I have to go yet, but when I do, I know you'll understand. He zippered the bag up and pulled it from the closet. I've got to leave.
I want to understand now,
Shar said petulantly. He shook his head. There just isn't any time to talk about it now.
No time.
She turned away for a moment when she faced him again. Her expression had darkened.
Harrison, I swear.
Her tone was dangerous, threatening.
If you leave like this, it's over for us.
It was all so melodramatic, so petty that he half laughed, shook his head in disbelief, and spread his hands. Charlotte, he began helplessly. This wasn't the woman he knew. This was someone else, a spoiled brat that he didn't like very much. Look at you, Shar. You're positively seething. This is all so ridiculous. The laughter made her even more furious. Her green eyes narrowed.
Damn it, I mean it.
Ultimata don't become you, he said in a feeble attempt at lightness. We can discuss it when I get back. She trembled and clenched her fists.
You jerk.
Why, she was having a temper tantrum. Just how skilled an actress was she to have hidden this side of herself from him for almost 2 years? She was gasping with anger, frowning so hard her brows were touching. Her face contorted. At any moment he expected her to start stamping her feet. For some perverse reason, her overly childish reaction struck him as outright funny, and he snickered before he could stop himself. It was the worst possible thing he could have done, of course. She wheeled around on one hot pink heel and headed out. Harrison dropped the bag on the bed and followed, reaching after her. He caught her gently, firmly by the wrist, and walked around to face her. Come on, Shar, be reasonable. For a moment, he thought she was going to claw his eyes with those sharp pink nails. But then she relaxed in his grip and looked sulkily at him.
No, you be reasonable.
Translation: do it my way. The laughter had eased his anger. Now he was merely disgusted with her, but in control of himself. One of them had to play the adult here, and it obviously wasn't going to be Charlotte. Harrison turned her palm up, kissed it, then let go of her hand. Looks to me like we're having a major disagreement here. But there simply isn't time to resolve it now. I'll call you when I get to the hotel. He leaned down and tried to kiss her, but she pushed him away. Her expression so cold and hateful it took his breath away.
Don't bother.
Her tone was clipped, icy.
Goodbye, Harrison.
She strode out, the strand of pearls dancing from side to side. This time he didn't try to stop her, but stood staring at the empty doorway, not quite able to believe that she had really been serious. Well, crap, he said finally. He picked his bag up from the bed and went to catch his plane. Already bathed and in the long Minnie Mouse t-shirt that served as pajamas, Deb lay sprawled on her stomach in front of the TV, watching a rerun of Three's Company. The volume was turned up to an obnoxious level. Deb stared sullenly at the screen without seeing it, chin resting on one hand, which rested on a clean, college-ruled page in her open three-ring binder. A paperback edition of Macbeth stood spine up atop a hardcover volume of an introduction to algebra. Behind her, Suzanne staggered into the foyer and eased the heavy suitcase down by the front door, then frowned in the direction of the blaring TV. Mrs. Pennyworth was expected momentarily, Harrison in about 15 minutes. She'd finally wakened around noon, feeling as if what had happened last night were all part of a horrible dream. The shock of it had faded, leaving her with an odd sense of unreality. Even after Harrison had called with the travel arrangements, she still had trouble believing it was really true. That Harrison's paranoid fantasies were neither paranoid nor fantasies, that somewhere only a few hundred miles away, the aliens were making plans for a new attack. It was especially hard to believe now, here, watching the I Love Lucy-type antics on the screen in this all-too-normal domestic setting. Deb had been thrilled to see her mother at first. Then, after the announcement that Suzanne was leaving again, she'd settled into a protracted moping session. The TV, with its ridiculous volume, Suzanne knew, was a none too subtle display of hostility. Deb hated that particular show and never watched it.
Deb?
She said, walking into the living room. No response. Debbie was pretending not to hear. She spoke louder, enough to make herself heard over the roar of the laugh track.
Deb, turn that down, please.
Deb rose languidly and complied without looking at her mother.
Doesn't look to me like you've done your homework. No,
Deb murmured. She was a lousy liar, like her mother, and therefore usually didn't attempt it.
You know the rule,
Suzanne said firmly, doing her best not to look surprised. She hadn't invoked the TV rule in at least a year. Deb was an A student, at least one way that she did not take after her father, who did her homework cheerfully, without being told, then read voraciously in her free time. Her appreciation of television was limited to Jeopardy and National Geographic specials. Deb muttered a little as she clicked off the TV. Blessed relief.
What was that, young lady?
Deb faced her mother grudgingly, face tilted down, hair falling in her eyes.
I don't understand. Why do you have to leave again so soon? You just got back. I'll be home day after tomorrow, chicken.
She moved over to the sofa near Deb and sat down. Chicken wasn't an accusation of cowardice, but a term of affection she'd picked up from Derek. She'd forgotten its origin. Maybe it had had something to do with Suzanne being an old mother hen.
I will not feel guilty, damn it.
But it was too late. Even though she'd gone over this 1,000 times in her head last night and this afternoon, there was no cause for guilt. She had to go to Washington, pure and simple. It was the best thing she could do for Deb and for herself and Harrison. For everyone.
And then when will you leave again?
Deb whined. She felt a minor surge of irritation at her daughter's petulant attitude, but the question caught her off guard.
I don't know. Maybe they'll let me stay home for a while after this.
Deb's tone was snotty, entirely unlike her.
You still didn't say why. You can knock off that tone of voice right now, Deborah Ann,
Suzanne warned.
I'm not leaving because I want to. I'd much rather stay here with you. But it's my job, and I have to do it. I can't discuss it with you because it's a secret, like my job in Ohio. You're grown up enough to understand that, and frankly, I already feel rotten about having to leave you with Mrs. Pennyworth like this. I wouldn't do it unless what I had to do was very, very important. More important than me?
Suzanne stood up. Somehow she managed to keep her voice calm.
Deb, you know that isn't true. You're the most important thing in the world to me. But that's a cruel thing of you to say. If you're going to keep trying to make me feel worse than I already do, maybe it'd be better for you to go pout in your room before you say something to make me lose my temper.
Deb looked up at last, stricken, and said in a wavering low voice,
Mom, I'm sorry. I don't mean to make you feel bad, too. It's just that...
The corner of her trembling mouth quirked down. A tear slid down the side of her nose.
Poor old chicken.
Suzanne held out her arms.
Come over here.
Deb came over and clutched at her. Suzanne sat down and situated her daughter in her lap.
Poor old chicken,
she soothed, giving Deb a big hug and kissing the top of her head. The girl's hair was soft and fine and smelled of baby shampoo.
This has all been too much for you, hasn't it?
Deb nodded, her face buried in Suzanne's shoulder.
Were things any better at school today? It's okay, Deb murmured. There's one girl who's nice. I'm glad, Suzanne said. That's a start. And I haven't forgotten about those new clothes. I promise you'll get them when I get back.
Deb sat up and shook her head.
I don't care about the clothes anymore,
she said, her voice miserable but no longer accusatory.
I'm just tired of being alone, that's all. You'll be with Mrs. Pennyworth.
Debbie sighed with the exaggerated disgust of an adolescent.
It's not the same, Mom. She's nice and all, but she's old. So am I, Suzanne answered lightly. What's that got to do with anything? She's a very interesting person. You ought to get to know her better. I guess I'll get the chance.
The corner of Deb's mouth twisted up wryly in a feeble effort at good humor. She wiped the tears from her cheeks.
That's my girl.
Suzanne hugged her, overwhelmed with affection and a sense of panic.
If anything happens to me, good Lord, who would take care of Debbie?
Suzanne's father was dead. Her mother near 70 and living in a retirement community in Florida, too old to take care of a child. And Derek couldn't be trusted to do right by his own daughter.
That's it, McCullough,
she told herself.
You're simply going to have to stay alive. I'll get it,
Deb said with abrupt cheerfulness when the doorbell rang, and wriggled out of Suzanne's grasp to dash into the foyer. Suzanne watched her as she stood on tiptoe to peer through the peephole, then opened the door to let Mrs. Pennyworth in.
Please, God,
she prayed. She was not a religious person, but there were times when she became so out of sheer desperation.
If we could just stop them in time so Deb doesn't even have to know.
More than anything, she wanted to spare her daughter the terror she had experienced as a child. waiting in the dark. Mrs. Pennyworth stepped into the living room carrying a small tan overnight bag. Her silver blonde hair was wound around her head in a thick braided coil, giving her a distinctly old-world look from the neck up, which was immediately contradicted by the faded Levi's and bright yellow Reeboks she wore. Suzanne rose.
"Let me take that to your bedroom for you, Mrs. Pennyworth,"
Debbie offered gravely. Thrusting out a hand, Suzanne smiled at her daughter. Such a good kid after all she'd been through.
"Why, thank you, Deborah."
Mrs. Pennyworth beamed as she handed Deb the overnight bag, then took the proffered seat next to Suzanne on the couch.
"What a sweet daughter you have, Suzanne." "She certainly is,"
Suzanne remarked as Deb scampered off with the bag.
"And now, will you be calling me from Washington to let me know where you're staying?" "This time I've actually got the number of the hotel where I can be reached. The Crystal City Hyatt. I left it on the pad next to the kitchen phone. The flights are there, too."
She sighed, suddenly exhausted and overwhelmed by the thought of the journey ahead.
"I should be back the day after tomorrow, in the afternoon. 3:45, I think, is when the flight arrives."
Mrs. Pennyworth's light gray eyes regarded her with concern.
"You seem very tired. I hope your trip is an easy one." "Thanks."
She ran a hand over her forehead. It was warm, and the coolness of her palm was soothing.
"So do I. I'm afraid this has all been a little rough on Deb, though. She's pretty upset that I'm leaving again. I hope she isn't any trouble." "A bright child like Deborah is never trouble."
Mrs. Pennyworth rested folded hands beneath her ample bosom.
"Soon she'll understand why you must take these trips." "Dear God, I hope not,"
Suzanne whispered without thinking, a hint of fear in her voice. Mrs. Pennyworth gave her a sharp look. After a pause, she said,
"I think you should know that Clayton Forrester was a colleague of mine. I also know Harrison very well. When I saw all this traveling in the middle of the night, all this urgency, well, it is enough to make an old woman like myself frightened."
She knew. Suzanne stared down at her own lap, feeling a curious mixture of relief and shock at the fact. She turned to face her.
"I wish I could tell you something reassuring, Mrs. Pennyworth, but I can't."
She propped her elbows on her knees and lowered her forehead into her hands.
"It looks bad. Very bad."
Mrs. Pennyworth bowed her head for a moment.
"I see."
She seemed to come to a decision, then looked back over at Suzanne.
"If it gets too dangerous, you call me, yes? That way I can be sure to get Deborah to some place that's safe."
Suzanne nodded, unable to speak.
"Mom?"
Debbie asked quizzically as she came back into the room.
"Why are you crying?"